I'd like to begin with Dr. Hall. Jonathan, since you coined the term, I want to ask you why hunting while black?
Mm.
Because I never heard of hunting while white. So why do we need to emphasize blackness when we talk about something that is so common, a common American outdoor activity?
Yeah, that's a really great opening question. I think what immediately came to mind when you asked that question is uh, I've heard throughout my life people say like, why don't we have a White History Month, or why if we had like a white entertainment television channel, that would be racist. So why do we have a black one? Why do we have to emphasize blackness? And I think that the short answer to that question is that because of the sort of like presumed ubiquity of whiteness that goes unnamed in a lot of spaces, right? And when I think in the United States of America, when you think about hunting, you think about a white dude, and we're socialized to think that. I think, and so hunting while black, I think, draws attention to the fact that for black people and other people of color, entering into a space of hunting is needs special attention, right? I talk about in the podcast, and I've mentioned in my writings that going to rural spaces in the United States of America with a firearm as a black person is not really a comfortable thing, because I'm not expected to be in that place, and that unexpected blackness oftentimes gets black people killed. So hunting while black is different than hunting while white, and it's important to pay attention to that difference, because without that specific attention, we just make the assumption, we're socialized to make the assumption that the person that we are going to be encountering or talking about is a white person, and also a white man, right? Oftentimes when we think about hunting in this country, we don't think about women, either. So I think that's an important thing to highlight.
So are you saying that do people who say that they are colorblind because they treat everyone equally put you in danger in hunting space? And you know, are these people? Do you consider these people also non-racist?
Mm. So yeah, you thrown out some good terms there. I think the first one, colorblind, in terms of, because I don't want to be ableist, in terms of paying attention to race, right? Race as color as a proxy for race, is not a good thing. I think that a lot of white people are socialized to think that being colorblind is a good thing in terms of race. Maybe I'll say race blind, or racially unconscious or disconscious, is not a good thing. And I think oftentimes when people invoke colorblind language, they are saying, I don't judge people negatively based on their racial identity, right? And that's obviously something that we all need to do, right? If we say that we want to live in a just society, and where people are free to do the things that they want to do, and have equal protection under the law, then we need to move away from judging people based on their racial identity or their presumed racial identities. Um, but what oftentimes happens, and the danger of not paying attention to someone's racial identity, is that you don't see the ways in which different identities are marginalized, right? So if you don't see race, then you don't see the disproportionate impact that for example, the war on drugs has had on black people, or the fact that black people make up a larger percentage of the prison population than is represented sort of overall in the United States. You don't see that black girls in public schools are more likely to be suspended for the same behaviors as their white counterparts. And so it's important that we pay attention to race, because race structures everything in our society, whether or not we're consciously aware of it or not. And when we're talking about hunting, and we're talking about like why everyone is here, why there's 75 people in this room. Like, we're all here because of race. Like, we're all here because, you know, the topic of race and Blackness means something to us. Whether or not that's, you know, we identify that way and we want to connect, or whether or not we want to learn more. So this is a racially conscious space. So I want to thank you for hosting this, and that's why it's really important. The other term that you mentioned was non-racist, right? And I think that's a really important term to think about and talk about, because people who oftentimes uncritically invoke colorblind language as it relates to race sort of settle in the space of being non-racist. And, you know, because whiteness, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism structure so much of our society, and that these oppressive structures can exist without people actively hating or actively you know, actively having animus towards different or non-white, non-male, non-able-bodied groups of people, it's important that we actively deconstruct those structures, right? So being non-racist just sort of is also not a good space to be in, because you sort of tend to sit back and be like, well, I don't dislike Black people, right? But that's really not enough, right? Because so much of our society is structured by racism that you have to be anti-racist in order to claim the space of being an ally or an accomplice, right? Being non-racist just means like, I don't really get down with that. But if you just sort of sit on the sidelines and not actively disrupt these structures, then they're going to continue. So you have to be anti-racist to claim that space of doing good in the world. And so when I hear people say like, oh, I'm colorblind, or oh, I don't see color, or, you know, all of these sort of like non-racist terms, to me, that's an indication and a signal that those folks who are invoking that language and claiming that identity aren't really thinking deeply enough and critically enough about the structures of racism and how racism affects people without there being racist. There's a book, and I forget the name of the author, but a book called Racism Without Racists. And it talks about how people can be non-racist, right? But if they don't actively disrupt these structures and the results of them, then, you know, we end up with still a racist society, right? And there are lots of examples. There are lots of examples of this, you know. Yeah.
I want to turn to Mike and Amy. So you are the co-producers of the Pickle Shelf Radio R, an amazing podcast. And I was looking at the topics that you covered in the first year of this podcast, and you recently wrapped up the first season of this show with a theme on hunting wild black, and Jonathan was your main guest on that episode. And the first episode of the show, you celebrated Lunar New Year and Cantonese food. Second episode featured sausage making tradition of a West Virginia family with roots in northern Spain. Then you joined a Kurdish family to celebrate Nowruz, Ramadan, and Eid, looking at Muslim traditions. Then you did an episode on seeds and how seeds are culturally identified by their stewards. You also interviewed me for that episode as well. So I want to ask you, 95% of West Virginia's population is white Americans. So why do you put so much effort into exploring and understanding cultures, religions, languages different than yours, making meaningful connections with non-white Americans, and looking at topics such as food justice and environmental racism in a podcast? Why wouldn't be talking about recipes and cooking enough? You're muted.
Okay, so that's a great question. I think a lot of this has to do with you know, the business that we have built at Lost Creek Farm is very much rooted in stories and storytelling about food and cultures and the way that people connect to place and the way that people connect to other people and you know, animals, plants, whatever around them in community. And I think over the years, as we've done this, Amy and I have been kind of singled out at times as sort of like poster children, if you will, for this Appalachian food trend. And part of what happens when you have a trend that is based on sort of culture is you have a lot of people sort of angling to define what it is or what it isn't, right? So like I think we saw that a lot with this sort of newish Appalachian food trend is you had a lot of people sort of dig in on kind of common narratives and tropes and stereotypes about what constitutes Appalachia and the people who make up the populace of Appalachia, right? So I think in a lot of our storytelling, not just on the podcast, we try to disrupt a lot of those narratives because we want to sort of get at this question. Because every time something happens where there is food that is presented that is of the community of people that live here, there's often a reaction from somebody who says, well, that's not Appalachian, that's Lebanese, or that's Southern soul food, or something that sort of challenges the Appalachianness of the people behind the food. And to us, that's kind of like a silly thing to get hung up on, because I think if you are trying to represent a region and you're trying to represent food and culture of the people who live here, then it's kind of silly to draw these lines and say, well, the Swiss immigrants who came here in 1880s are more Appalachian than, the Italian miners or the Lebanese merchants or people who came up from the South in the Great Migration. Those people aren't really Appalachian because they're sort of thinking of this narrow identity of Appalachianness. And to us, all of the people who are in our podcast are people that we are really strongly and tightly in community with. And those are people who, make oftentimes more valuable contributions, and they sort of like feel the strongest about the place and their sort of cultural and place-based identities and sort of settling into this area than a lot of people I know who sort of consider themselves more Appalachian than others. So I think a lot of times for us, it's like we always approach this from a position of, asking ourselves, like, what are the stories that are not really being told? What are the stories that, leave people in certain communities overlooked? And I think that, to Jonathan's point, it's like hunting is always a narrative that comes up about Appalachian food, but it is always a narrative of whiteness, right? So like that is like, if we're going to do a show, because at this point, we've had several years of experience and sort of watching this dialogue unfold around Jonathan's experiences hunting here, largely from our farm. That was where we wanted to emphasize the story about hunting.
Yeah. So Amy, I want to ask you, I know that you work on the storyboard of each episode of the podcast. And when I listened to the episode where you had Jonathan as a guest, I clearly felt the care that was given to the storyline. Could you please share with us how different working on the storyboard on a documentary on environmental racism and Blackness in wilderness was?
Yeah, it was really different from the other podcast episodes that we had worked on, just because it is such an important and sensitive topic. And so we really wanted to be sure that we got it right. And we wanted to be thoughtful about it. And we also wanted, how to put it, we wanted people to listen and to kind of get invested in the story. And so it was important to us to kind of show a journey, or part of a journey through the episode. And so I think that just the delicateness of the topic and everything that's happened in the last year, we just wanted to get it right. And so we really took our time and we went through it again and again. And it was probably the most edited episode that we have put out to date.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that played into it. one was just that, we're being extremely good friends with someone like Jonathan. We want to do right by the people who are in our podcast, but also, with this issue more than a lot of others, we wanted to, like Amy said, we wanted to make it something that people would listen to. And part of an editorial tactic for that was like being very intentional about making it seem like this was a journey that we were on, and it wasn't sort of an issue where it was like you're either racist or you're not, or you've arrived or you haven't, right? Like I think that is one of the most sort of important things about relaying these kinds of messages to, a lot of the people that we know from our community now, or people that we grew up with in all white spaces, is not to try to sort of express these ideas through this sort of performative standpoint where we're saying like, oh, we know a lot more than you do about racism and you should take it from us, right? Because like I think one of the more valuable points of being actually in community and being intentional about building a relationship with people who can help you understand these things is knowing that that journey never stops and you continue to learn at every moment, right? So like I think making sure that that sort of showed up in the episode, that that we have learned a lot, even though we maybe sort of thought we already knew a lot, but we're also learning a lot all the time, I think is a really important sort of strategy that we employed to to tell this story. Because I think it's like, this year and the past year especially, there are a lot of sort of white people who sort of put themselves out there as, these people who know everything there is to know about anti-racism work, right? And I think that there's like those people and their points get taken less than seriously, I should say, in the communities that we try to reach with our storytelling.
My next question will be to all of you. Maybe let's begin with Jonathan. Is being anti-hunting also anti-Indigenous? If so, is it unconditional anti-Indigenous, or under what circumstances would it be anti-Indigenous?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. And I would speak to that as somebody who is not Indigenous, right? I don't identify as Indigenous, and don't claim community, don't claim like family community with any Indigenous group. And I think that's important to say that, because sometimes that can be sort of an ambiguous thing. But I think that the terms and the way that we understand the landscape and lifeways in this country sits on top of ongoing Indigenous genocide, right? And so the existence of this institution, right, WVU and many other institutions are at its heart anti-Indigenous, right? Because they sit on stolen land and they were financed by stolen land, right? So I think that because of that, because those of us who are not Indigenous live on these lands, sit in a space that was established and built by people who, those in power who were bent on destroying Indigenous lifeways to build what we now live in and exist today, we have to attend to that history in everything that we do, right? And if we are not doing that, if we're not conscious of that, then we run the risk of being actively anti-Indigenous in the things that we do. So when I think about like the hunting industry, particularly like this issue of public land, and the shirts that I've seen, like I'm a public landowner. To me, that's anti-Indigenous, right? Because where did those lands come from? How were they acquired? How did they become in the public trust of the United States of America, right? I think that the idea of having public spaces that people who belong to a certain community, in this case, the larger community of the United States, having land available for people to subsist on and to recreate on is a good thing. But if we're not paying attention to the fact that all these lands were stolen, right, then we run the risk of being anti-Indigenous. So that's why in the podcast, you know, and also kind of in other readings and everything and writing that I've done, I've really leaned on Indigenous scholars and Indigenous activists and just Indigenous people when they've been generous enough to share their ideas and thoughts to really kind of think about, you know, what it would mean as I entered into this idea of hunting, like what it would mean for me to participate in this activity, something that I didn't grow up doing, that I didn't have a tradition doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is, unless we are paying attention to and are in conversation with the legacies of settler colonialism, and ongoing indigenous genocide, unless we are consciously and actively involved in disrupting those sorts of things, then we run the risk of any activity that we're doing, including hunting, being anti-Indigenous. And that's not to say that like we get it right, or that we are empowered to on our own sort of correct all of the ills that we see. But it's important that we are in conversation and in community with those ideas and that history, so that we can figure out how we can do better about that. So yeah.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Macadamia? I mean, I know that you reflect a lot on indigenous traditions when you make a meal out of you know, the seeds that have been stewarded for thousands of years by, you know, indigenous people, and try to understand their relation with nature. So what are your thoughts on this as white Americans, white people from West Virginia?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, the West Virginia piece of it too, because when we are brought up in West Virginia, when we're sort of taught West Virginia history in school, we're often taught, right, that like there's no sort of tangible indigenous history, at least in the kind of modern context, around the time of white settlement. So that sort of has become this tactic to kind of absolve ourselves from any sort of thoughts or feelings about indigeneity attached to this part of Appalachia, because we sort of can say like, oh, well, there's no sort of, there were no tribal claims, you know, in the 1800s when all these settlers arrived in the late 1700s or whenever it really was. So it sort of has turned into this narrative about West Virginia just being this, you know, open place where people would come and go, and there were no native claims here. So there, you know, we don't have to worry too much about land theft or genocide or anything when we're talking about West Virginia history. So we always, you know, we do try to take advantage of opportunities to challenge that narrative. But I think, you know, another thing that kind of sticks with me when you think about a lot of the teachings that come from some of these scholars and activists that Jonathan, I'm sure, has in mind, you know, there's something that I've heard a few people sort of say along the lines of, you know, you may not be indigenous to the place where you live, but it is not too late, and you still have a responsibility to do right by the ancestors. And I think, you know, we try to keep that in mind in a lot of our teaching. And I think that's the other thing sort of about this podcast episode with Jonathan, was a lot of it was about sort of, you know, racism in terms of the way that we think about racism now, but a lot of it is also along in the terms of racism and anti-indigeneity as it relates to like being in relation with the natural community around you and trying to do right by those ancestors, you know. And I think that is where we try to focus probably more of our sort of, you know, teaching and our storytelling, is sort of like on what it means to be in relation with these things that we expect, you know, to sustain us. And I think that, you know, if you listen to the podcast episode, that's why we try to emphasize that so much. because it is also, I mean, it's a different concept in a way, but it is so directly related and intertwined with the teaching and the learning about anti-racism that we sort of wanted to get across as well. Because, you know, you can't really learn from people, and you can't really develop relationships with these ideas if you're not intentional about being in relation, and providing something in this reciprocal fashion, to, you know, these people or these, you know, works or whatever it is that you expect to sustain you with this knowledge. So, you know, it's interesting. It's an interesting time of year to be talking about this, because it's spring, and that means it's ramp season, and ramp season is one of the ways that this always kind of comes up the most in West Virginia and across Appalachia, where people are harvesting ramps, because there's, you know, there are different opinions maybe about like what are the best ways to harvest ramps, and, you know, what works and what doesn't work. And I think that's okay for people to have different opinions, because they have tried to study these things. But I think, you know, what I often try to tell people is like, what is the language that's being used? Because that's how you can tell the extent and the sort of intentionality in someone's relations. You know, if they're sort of saying like, well, my preference, my sort of like what I've observed, and the most sustainable way to harvest ramps, because I care about this community of ramps and I want to keep them alive, is this, then that's something. I think you can respect those differences of opinion just as a matter of fact. But if somebody's, you know, posting photos and sort of saying like, you know, I can dig all the ramps I want, and look, I've got all the roots, and suck it, hipster liberals, like this is how I've done it and nothing's ever changed because my ramp patch looks totally fine. Like that is not what I would call, you know, like being in good relation. And I think a lot of these people, they sort of get hung up, whether it's ramps or hunting, or actually a lot of the reactions to Jonathan's writing on racism has been sort of framed by individualism, right? It's like, well, sort of, oh, there's over harvesting of ramps. Well, I'm not at fault here because my ramp patch looks fine. You know, like, oh, there's systemic racism. No, I am not a racist person. Like it's the same kind of reaction. And I think it sort of brings up a lot of challenges, and you know, like a lot of challenges to, you know, like these ideas of what it means to sort of, you know, be in good relation with, you know, people and the other organisms in these communities.
So this is interesting. You know, it's great that Jonathan brought up the hunting industry, because it connects in a different way to you, Mike and Amy, as well. You know, so let's all talk about this a little bit more, maybe, because Mike and Amy grew up in West Virginia, and Mike actually was also a guest of Seedy Talks last year, talking about the extractive practices of chemical companies and how this affected the lives of people in his family, and also how it specifically actually affected Black communities in the state. So how do these speak to each other? You know, hunting industry, extractive chemical industry. So how does it, you know, what does it tell us about the way the hunting is practiced in the state? What is the difference between hunting and killing? Maybe that would be another question. I don't know. Do you want to elaborate on that, Johnson, a little bit, and then I will.
Yeah, I think, you know, I'll pick up, you know, where Mike was talking about like the commonality of reactions that people have when they're confronted with inconvenient truths and realities about, you know, the way that they live and how they're thinking about things, right? So this kind of like, if you're not consciously aware of, you know, these broader structures, if you're not consciously aware of the way that whiteness is constructed, Blackness is constructed, Indigenous identities are constructed, and then how the social structures that we live in and everything is structured around the value of those different identities, sort of in a hierarchy, then you're going to take up, you know, these sort of like white supremacist tropes in your resistance to thinking more broadly about your impact, right? You know, I think that, you know, the similarities that we see between the extractive industry, the hunting industry. I mean, like, there's just the word industry in and of itself is to me, you know, a logical sort of outcome of settler colonialism. This idea that you're not going to you're not going to pay attention to the relations that you have around you. It's about extracting, right? It's about getting a singular thing or a singular set of things or a subset of things out of an environment or a space or people, and, you know, essentially screw everything else, right? So, you know, the timber industry, like, we're going to cut as many trees as we possibly can to make as much money as we possibly can and screw everything else. You know, the coal industry, we're going to get as much coal out of this mountain as we can and forget about whether or not we're actually going to be protecting the people who are doing this work, right? Let alone the environment and the broader environment that's going to be impacted. Like, we don't care about any of that. Like, we just want to make as much money as we possibly can to enrich ourselves. And with the hunting industry, you know, we see this in, like, oftentimes, you know, the way that the hunting industry is focused around, like, the biggest, you know, male animal, right? Like, if you're a great hunter if you're able to get like that big, you know, 12-point buck or whatever it is. I don't even know, like, really know those terms enough to be using them, because I don't really care about that. Like, I hunt to eat. I don't hunt to for sport or anything like that. And so, you know, when you pay attention to only you know, what you're able to extract out of a particular space or a particular relationship or a particular set of relations within a community, then you're going to sever relationships and you're going to be disruptive. And that's essentially the settler colonial project, right? Like, that's, you know, we see iterations of this at every sort of stage. So it's almost like anything that that comes out of, you know, sort of a United Statesian identity or a settler colonial identity is going to look very similar. It's going to, you know, it's going to be McDonald's, Burger King, Hardee's, or whatever, different iterations of the same thing. That's just not rooted in maintaining communities. It's not rooted in sustainability. It's not rooted in diversity. It's not rooted in, you know, building meaningful relationships and enriching that space. It's about extracting. So, you know, like, we see this reflected in the booming industry that is, like, camo clothing, right? And how much money you can make if you get into that business. We see this in you know, the proliferation of firearms in our community, and, like, the emphasis and the money that can be made off of producing those firearms for different reasons. We see that in you know, the way that deer communities and other communities that are hunted for food, you know, we're struggling to maintain healthy communities because you know, we've disrupted the other relations, the predators that would be also feeding on these communities. And then really our primary interest as those people who remain on the landscape or have the largest footprint on the landscape is only harvesting, you know, the oldest, biggest males of a particular species. And you know, that causes all sorts of issues with the ecology of the area. So yeah, I mean, I think it's all tied together, that, you know, settler colonial society, unless it disrupts its settler colonialness and ultimately destroys its settler colonial nature, is always going to produce things that, at least from, maybe not from the outset, but eventually turn into an industry, this extractive process. And it's really sad, but it's been going on for 500 years on these lands, 500 plus years on these lands.
Yeah. Anything to say on this, Mike and Amy?
Well, I mean, I think for me, like, growing up in West Virginia and sort of seeing how extractive industry has kind of defined our existence as a state, I mean, it was easy to see a lot of the parallels between all the other extractive industries and sort of hunting as an industry, because it is all sort of like wrapped up in this kind of portrayal of this flex of humans dominating nature, you know, and it is, like, very much counter to this idea of being in relation, but it's all, you know, it's sort of like, you know, who can like kill the biggest buck, who can dig the most coal, who can like cut the biggest trees. I mean, it has always sort of been like, it's like our expression of dominance over nature. And you see that in extractive industry. And I think that was why, I got kind of turned off of hunting in a way when I was younger. Is it just sort of, it felt very much like this flex that I was kind of uncomfortable with. And a lot of that hunting was not hunting for food. It was like, this hunting just to sort of show off the dominance and like show off the trophy aspect of it by itself, without any sort of mind to, what it was like to hunt for sustenance. And, we still have these experiences. I mean, we live just down the road from us. They put out a dumpster every hunting season, and that thing fills up with carcasses of, deer. The horns have been cut off. Maybe if you're lucky, like the back straps are cut out, but oftentimes we'll like take a look at this thing and it's like, there are all these deer, all these lives just ended only for the antlers, right? Or we have people that we know who like, yeah, I killed these deer, but I don't like the taste of it. So, I had to try to find something to do with it. And but they'll still post, it's like the pictures of the huge 12-point rack or whatever. It's like that part of it is still, what they get out of it. And that is what is heavily marketed. I mean, if you go in the fall, if you go to like your hardware store, you'll see, these deer corn or whatever the products are that they're marketed, and it's all called like, buck slayer or whatever. And it's like the idea behind like this sort of American, like machismo of hunting is that it's all about sort of like killing the biggest things for show. And, there's like hardly any time where you can go to these places and you can see products that are marketed as like harvesting the most delicious deer from the forest. It's like we've kind of replaced like the original purpose of hunting, which was for sustenance, with this other sort of like expression of machismo. And the other thing, because you brought it up, so this talk that I did last year for Seedy Talks that Mehmet was referencing, it was about the chemical industry in West Virginia. And one thing I'll just say about the way that those are related, since that was part of your question, was that whether it is the narrative of sort of like that I was talking about earlier of indigenous people not existing here, or it is sort of the development of certain stereotypes about people in Appalachia, to sort of people outside of Appalachia from establishing sympathy with them, because that is part of extractive industry, is to sort of have a controllable population and keep everybody else from having sympathy with them. That is something that we see in these communities affected by extractive industry, and also the chemical industry that I talked about last year, where there were so many health effects that were showing up, particularly in Black communities in certain neighborhoods around Charleston. The same narratives came up. It was about the kinds of people who were experiencing these effects, the kinds of people who were most affected by these industries. It's like they're lazy and they make the wrong lifestyle choices, and it's all their fault somehow. And just sort of another way to keep these industries alive and robust without sort of allowing for public sentiment outside of those communities to be on the side of the people actually most affected by it.
Right. So maybe in connection with this, Jonathan actually recently published an article about game meat, harvest of game meat in West Virginia. And I'm going to read from this article. And then you estimated that approximately 10 million pounds of game is harvested each year, a figure that significantly exceeds the domesticated red meat raised and processed within the state by 25% annually. And then the per capita big game harvest in West Virginia was significantly higher than that of all neighboring states, and was enough to provide nearly 40% of the state's food insecure population with red meat for an entire year. So can you talk a little bit about hunting through the perspective of food justice and hunger issues in the state.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I think that like the one thing that was really important for that article was kind of born out of thinking about food and food insecurity in the state, and the fact that hunting was just not, I was not finding it at all in any of the literature. And I knew that it was something that was really important for people here in the state to do, to hunt. It was part of the identity that I understood as like being a West Virginian, right? But I wasn't seeing it in any discussions of like, okay, well, we have food insecure populations, and knowing and talking with people that like hunting and foraging also was something that people did to meet food insecure, to sort of meet the challenge of food insecurity. So I was just like curious, like this is something that I was interested in doing, like learning to hunt, and I just wonder how much meat is being harvested from the landscape. And so we did that study and found that it's a lot of damn meat that people are harvesting, but that goes unaccounted for. So then in turning the lens of race to that work, and again, this is sort of like still in process, and I began to ask the question, like, what would happen if the amount of meat that we're estimating is coming from the landscape were put to a different use, right? I mean, Mike mentioned, Lost Creek and people just throwing away, not just in Lost Creek, but like all over. And I guess the other thing that I want to just pause and mention is that, we're talking about Appalachia, we're talking about West Virginia, but particularly when I talk about like structural racism and whiteness, it's not, there's not like a special brand of whiteness and racism in West Virginia, right? I mean, it shows up in slightly different places, but really I'm talking about like the larger structures. So I just want to be clear about that like not singling out any particular community or state or region as being like especially racist or especially problematic. But so getting back to like wild food, I mean, many of us who hunt and are involved with wild foods, like we know these stories of people who hunt for trophies, and then like what do they do with the meat, right? Are they actually consuming these animals? And the fact that that's not so much a thing is again an example of like this settler colonial ecologies and relations that exist, where people don't feel, people are socialized to think that it's not an issue for them to hunt, to take a life, and then to just use a part of that animal for their own sort of like decoration or their own pride or whatever, or just for the fun of killing. And so, so that this is a resource that's being used, it's being exploited, it's being extracted. But what would happen if we were to think about this practice that's really important for a lot of people in a broader context of meeting the food insecurity needs of people who don't have access to normative food systems? And so that makes me think about like food deserts and how food deserts are constructed landscapes, right? Like people don't have access to the nutrition that they need, not because the environment doesn't provide it, because it does. Indigenous people have lived all over the world for millennia upon millennia. And, most of the food insecurity is not really a thing, right? Because our social structures were such that people got fed, and if one person suffered, then that meant that everybody was suffering, right? It didn't mean that there were these cloistered sort of areas and like there are disadvantaged people in certain areas and it's because of personal choice, that sort of stuff. It's because of these structures that we've constructed. So how do we plug these gaps in those structures so that people can have what they need? And so the fact that like I don't know what I had estimated beforehand the amount of meat that was being harvested, but when we actually did that research and did those calculations, I was astounded. That's a lot of meat coming off the landscape. And certainly, like we're not going into people's freezers or with them in the field and saying, we know that people are consuming this amount. We just know how many deer are harvested, right? We know relatively reasonably like the sex and age or age class of the deer. So we can estimate like how much meat would on average be available to someone. And so certainly not all of that is being used. But you know, it's a shame that there's that much, and there's that much available on the landscape. There's still people going hungry. But then, you know, all we have to do is think about like the fact that, you know, in the United States of America, we throw away half of our food. Right? It's reflective of the tremendous waste and the settler colonial ecologies and mindsets that are the social structures and structures that we built in this country. And we think about how, you know, buffalo were driven to extinction because of whiteness, right? Not because of you know, like, oh, the buffalo were hunted to extinction. But I think it's important to locate what was the driver of that. You know, buffalo being killed from a train, sometimes 200 in a day by a single person. And some money was being made off of the hides and everything, but really that was to eliminate a food base for indigenous people who were resisting the settler colonial project, right? And so, you know, I see this research as a way to, again, disrupt settler colonialism, to disrupt whiteness as a structure, and to get us thinking about ways that to move us away from the scarcity mindset, right? Because that's another thing that really drives a lot of how the United States society is structured, right? Everything is scarce. You know, like you need to take this job because if you don't, you can't work to feed yourself, and there's not enough food on the landscape, and there's housing is scarce, and you know, all these opportunities are scarce, which is just not the way that you know, the first people of these lands sort of lived and understood the landscape. But you see the way that scarcity functions to drive people into certain behaviors and keep them within certain structures. So we think more abundantly about something that's already being done, hunting, and that the hunting industry is concerned about there not being enough done. As long as you're not talking to Matt Ranella, who wrote this awful article for the Meat Eater about the case against hunter recruitment, which was just a big pile of garbage. But you know, and Hunters of Color, which is an organization, wrote a really good rebuttal article about that. But you know, again, like that article was written from a scarcity mindset, right? Like, oh no, we don't want to have more people hunting because then that means that there's going to be less for me, right? All of that comes of whiteness and white supremacy, and the settler colonial mindset that is this nation, right? We have to like put boundaries around our own resources. So sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think that like what that research does, I think serves to broaden the scope of what we think of our resources and how they can be used. And when we think about food insecurity and how it disproportionately impacts women and people of color, particularly women of color, I think that work is a gateway potentially maybe to push food research in paying attention to these things and start to think about these things and research them so that we can do a better job of feeding people, right? Because we have the resources, right? Yeah. We live in an abundant landscape. We live in an abundant space. Yeah. But we're not using it the way that supports all people and creates a sustainable space.
We are over time, but we began, I think 6 or 7 minutes late, and then I have a couple more questions, which I think, you know, is here. I'm going to share an image. So this picture was taken. It was also in our flyer. Was Mike Costello, and then I think this is an amazing photograph. And why is it so? Let me give you a little bit background about it. In 1920, there were 14% land-owning Black farmers across the United States, and today only 1.4% of the farmers in the farms in the country are controlled by Black farmers. Similarly, only 2% of the hunters in the country are Black. Hence, I think this is a very rare archival document. There is also one important detail in it that reflects, I think, there's a certain tension in it that whenever I look at it, I see. And there's one tree in the background, um, which I think symbolizes the tension between Black people and nature, and outdoors. Um, can you tell us a little bit about the significance of the tree? Why it causes anxiety, and also perhaps Mike also can elaborate a little bit about the composition of this picture, how that moment happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the tension between Black people and the outdoors and particularly Blackness in trees is goes back to the white supremacist violence and the way that black bodies and Black people were controlled. So I think it's hard for me as a Black person to think about a tree without the context of lynching, right? And it's not necessarily that it's something that comes to top of mind all the time, but it's definitely there, right? And that has to do with the history of this country and the way that we're socialized to think about this history and these realities. I do want to shout out an amazing artist, journalist, human being, Raymond Thompson Jr., who in his work has taken on sort of like the relationship of Black people and trees in some of his amazing art. And again, sort of like interrogating this inheritance that we all have, right? Not just Black people, but everyone in this country who spends time in this country inherits the legacy of lynching and white supremacist violence. And so, I think that this photo is incredible. And it stirs up a lot for me as well, in thinking about Blackness in the outdoors. And I think it draws to the attention again, like the title of like Hunting While Black, right? Because it forces you, when you pay attention to Blackness and hunting in the outdoors, like you have to deal with more than just like the happy sort of like white dude in the woods who sort of like gets to do whatever he wants because there's no Indigenous people who are going to threaten them without the state violence coming back on those Indigenous people, and that it is a space that's been constructed by whiteness, right? So you need to sort of interrogate those things. The other thing that this photo brings up for me is the fact that I'm holding a rifle, and like Black people and guns, and firearms. It's often sort of like joked about that, like if you want to see meaningful gun legislation in this country, then you just get a bunch of Black people to go out and buy guns, right? And then we'll see gun legislation and gun control. And that's sort of like a joke, but it's also a reality, right? Because we saw what happened when organizations like the Black Panther Party started having bystander events with the police, where they would show up with their guns when the police showed up to do whatever the police were doing, and how nervous that made everybody. And so, in the podcast, we talk about, John Crawford and Tamir Rice. And, in my writings of Philando Castile, all people who were holding, well, Philando Castile had an actual firearm. John Crawford, had a BB gun in Walmart and was killed by the police. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy, was playing with a toy gun, and was shot by the police. Shoot first, ask questions later. And this really brought those particular incidents of like Black people being unexpected with what is perceived as a gun, and the consequence being death, really came forward for me, because during like trick-or-treating this past year, we were walking around the neighborhood and I saw a boy who was, I don't know, he had to be no older than 12, I think, probably Tamir Rice's age. and he pulled a black handgun out of his backpack, and it was just so disturbing for me to see that, because of, and immediately brought to mind like Tamir Rice, and knowing that, you know, I have two young children. There's no way in hell that I would ever let my kids outside the house with a toy handgun anywhere, not just West Virginia, but anywhere. And let alone one that was black. Like maybe if it was like turquoise and like some color that you wouldn't expect to see a firearm, but this was a black gun, right? Like jet black. And so, you know, I think like, and so it's sort of like a very serious thing. It's a very weighted thing, like this, what's involved in this picture. And the fact that whenever I hold my rifle, particularly when I'm outside of my home, I think about like what might some white person who observes me with a firearm think, right? Because Tamir Rice and John Crawford are dead because some white person called the police saying that they saw a black person with a firearm, right? And the police showed up and immediately understood that to be a threat that needed to be met with deadly force, right? Philando Castile gets pulled over and does the responsible thing of informing the police officer that he has a concealed carry permit and he has a concealed weapon. And the police officer completely loses his shit, excuse my language, and kills him, right? So these are the things that are on my mind. So like, while I see like this image is, I think, really important, and there's a lot of a feeling of how it might be disrupting the ways that we understand Blackness, I'm also like nervous for myself seeing this photo. Right, this photo gives me anxiety as well as gives me a lot of sense of pride in sort of like the positive things that it represents. But it also gives me anxiety. This is something I think about all the time. You know, like driving to Lost Creek to go hunt, or driving to Preston County to go hunt, or wherever with a firearm. I'm thinking about what happens if the police pull me over. Right? Do I tell them that I have a rifle in the car, right? And I think probably before Philando Castile was murdered, was killed, I probably would have said, yeah, I'm going to tell them. But now, no, there's no, I'm not going to say, I'm not going to disclose that, just in case they look in the back seat. But then, of course, then you think, well, what happens if I don't, and they look in the back seat and they see a firearm there, and I don't explain that, right? Because I know that people are socialized to think, are not socialized to think that a black person with a firearm in their car is going hunting, especially in West Virginia, right? Like, we're not going to be like, oh, that person's probably going hunting. They might think something else, like, you know, something worse. And then what is their reaction going to be? So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot wrapped up in this photo. And I think it's a great example of like what it is like to experience these sorts of things as a black person, right? Again, there's a lot that I'm proud of in this photo, but again, it gives me tremendous anxiety, right? Just seeing this image, that I have to deal with that. So it's like it's the combination, it's the both end of these sorts of things that are present in this photo, and the reality of being black in this space. I don't know if you can see it, but like I made my gunsling, like I used paracord and I like weaved it. And I don't know if you can notice, but 3 colors there are red, black, and green, which is the colors of the Pan-African flag, right? And that's very intentional, okay? So I made that as a way to sort of like deal with the anxiety of being a gun owner, of having a firearm in my car, right? And then what it meant to be a black person, you know, in their 30s, learning to hunt for the first time, and then doing it in West Virginia. And I only invoke West Virginia because West Virginia is overwhelmingly white. It's an overwhelmingly white state, right? And so, you know, there's all of that wrapped up in things. And I think that, again, that's what it's like to experience, you know, this country and this space as Black. You're looking through multiple lenses at the same time, and you have to, because if you don't, you could end up you can end up dead. And even if you do, you can still end up dead. But you know, without it, you're in a lot worse shape. So yeah, this is like, this will remain one of my favorite images like ever, because there's so much into that, wrapped up in that. So
Yeah, it's really powerful. Do you want to say anything about this, Mike?
I keep doing this with muted. You know, I didn't really have a lot in mind artistically about this set of photos, other than you know, sort of trying to portray the way that, you know, I know Jonathan sort of thinks about these things and experiences these things. And I think one of the things that part of it is like maybe somewhat intentional, but also part of it is just the fact that it was, you know, the two of us out hunting and I was the one taking the pictures, that sort of conveys and evokes this sort of aloneness in a way that kind of juxtaposes a lot of what you see from, you know, people I grew up, for instance, with for instance, who sort of, you know, all their hunting pictures are like them and all their buddies just having the best time ever, right? And I think that is like, because of all these things we've talked about, it's a very different experience. And I know that sort of, you know, Jonathan ends up kind of feeling like he's out on an island by himself a lot of the time. But I do think that, you know, when I think about this picture and I think about the conversations that we had to have, even for, you know, what was the image that we would put on the flyer, like there are other photos that were part of this set of Jonathan, you know, holding a rifle or sort of being more in shooting position or something. And we had to have conversations about how these pictures would be perceived and if these would be perceived as too violent, right? And we know that we probably wouldn't have to have those conversations if it were a white hunter with, you know, a gun and, you know, a deer in the scope. It's like we don't even have to talk about that because we know what the outcome is. But I think more than any other sort of single issue that is part of this conversation, this is the one where I think, you know, I try the hardest to get, you know, people that I know from, you know, my nearly all white community that I live in now, or my nearly all white community where I grew up, to sort of understand what it's like to be someone and experience things as someone who's different than you, because, you know, we all sort of want to apply our own experiences to sort of validate or invalidate somebody else's experiences, especially when it comes to gun violence at the hands of police. And I think that, you know, every time this happens, I see all these comments and it's like, well, if you just would have listened, you know, we wouldn't have had to worry about that. And then you know, or maybe you just shouldn't have a gun in your car. I mean, this is the thing. And then we see, you know, fully armed white protesters on the grounds of a state capitol building with fully automatic rifles, you know, and we say, like, well, what's the difference? Why is that just fine, but somebody else sort of you know, bears the burden of having to be careful with a handgun and or a rifle, a deer rifle. And I think the other thing to point out here, Jonathan mentioned some things about his gun. One of the things that you cannot see in this picture, but you would see when we're back at the house and he's packing up everything and getting ready to go, or when he's unpacking everything, he's got a trigger lock, a gun lock that is bright pink. And it is for a very intentional reason, to, you know, to, so like, what if that happens when the police see a rifle in the car? Hopefully, right, they also see that the bright pink lock is on and it's not able to be used. And that is just for people who, you know, don't have to think twice about being able to take a gun anywhere. It's just, you know, all of these experiences are you know, what we hope sort of builds a story that can help other people like us kind of see things in a different light by just sort of, you know, you never would think this is possible, right? It's like, of course I can take a gun, I can go in the woods, I can do whatever I want. But then you hear
To the grocery store.
Oh
You
yeah,
can
to the
take a gun to
grocery
the
store. But
grocery
then you
store.
hear all the layers of what that experience is like for somebody else. And
Yeah, even for this event, we had to you know, discuss, right, which image to use. Although the mascot of the university holds a gun, right?
Right.
But, you know,
Yeah.
it's a white person. So, but um, but I'm going to transition to my final question. Um, this is a little more personal about me and my relation and connection with Jonathan, because let me give a little bit context before I move on to the question. I became a farmer in Sicily in 2010, and I grew up in Turkey before coming to United States, and I'm Muslim, and I grew up in a big city, and then although I became a farmer in 2010, we were still living in a big city, Tampa, Florida, and I was commuting to a farmland that we were leasing back in time, so I was commuting. Um, so in 2018, 2019, my partner and I moved on to a 6-acre land in rural West Virginia. A majority of West Virginia is quite honestly rural, but this place is southeast of Morgantown, and so that was my first time living in rural settings in the United States, or ever, and in anywhere, So and I was very anxious, to be honest, for a few months because of gun practice around us. Loud gunshots, and being a foreigner from a different religion. It's I'm not a practicing Muslim, but still, you know, these experiences are not monolithic, but you don't know what people think about you right around you, because you are the only Muslim in the neighborhood, so you don't know what to expect. And our farm is adjacent to woods, and we own a strip of land in the woods, and one of our neighbors behind that strip of land owns 6 acre of the woods, and that's perfect hunting grounds. And houses are very close to each other. People can easily see each other, and I think it's quite different than the landscape in Lost Creek, which is kind of different because it's not easy to see the neighbors. So after I met Jonathan, coming to WVU and watching Anthony Bourdain's West Virginia episode of Parts Unknown, and if you didn't watch that, please do so, because all of our guests today are in it. And Bourdain actually did a great job, I think, by reflecting on the lifestyle of people without prejudice. He just gave a picture, provided a picture as is. And then I found out about Jonathan's article in reaction to that episode about hunting wildlife, and then and his passion about hunting. We began talking, and then Jonathan was pretty much the only faculty here that wanted to understand me, my lifestyle, what I eat, what I do. So I'll never forget that. I'm grateful for that. So we talked about these things, and it didn't take us too long to talk about this more. And me thinking that, what would Jonathan do in this rural setting, in our rural setting, if he wanted to hunt here? And then I found out about an incident through our conversations that happened in 2014 in West Virginia. A man shot and killed his black neighbors when he saw them inspecting what he mistakenly thought was his own land. Rodney Bruce Black of Barbersville was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The 2 men who were shot, Garrett Hopkins and Carl Hopkins Jr., were brothers. And then, I looked at different articles. There's some fascinating, like statements in those. It's just a terrible, terrible tragedy, said Cable County Sheriff. We are still trying to figure all of this out. Hopefully, we'll find out his reasoning as the investigation continues. And then the sheriff said there was no indication that race played a factor in the shooting of the 2 men. Throughout the trial, the shooter was found incompetent to stand trial. Then several months later, it was ruled that he was competent. Then in 2016, he was finally found incompetent again to stand trial in another competency hearing. So after also reading about this incident, I got even more nervous before thinking about Johnson as a black man hunting in the woods behind our house. But eventually, months later, this happened. I'll Jonathan, you don't have to, if you don't want, you don't have to share, private details that you don't want to. But I mean, it was, perhaps I didn't tell you this, but those few months that well, you more than I, but going through that later on made me really angry because we shouldn't have worry about just you coming to that place, just like everyone does. Like we shouldn't have had that nervous period of time to make sure that you feel safe to come there and hunt. And something actually, later on, I was very happy and grateful about this because our neighbor who owns the woods ended up being very helpful in the process. Um, could you please elaborate on those few months of your, I know you were stressful about it, stressful mental preparation before you felt safe enough to come down and hunt in the woods behind our property.
Yeah, I that that does take me back to sort of like the origins of our friendship and getting to know you and your lovely partner. Um, I think it's like a condition of anything, of any time like I'm out in rural spaces to hunt, um, and it's somebody else's land or it's public land. Um, but most of the time it's private land, and I'm not going to go to a place where I don't trust the people, excuse me, where I don't trust their consciousness around issues of race, right? And there's a very like close relationship with this with my children and being the parent of Black children. And so like right now, like my kids have like play dates and stuff with people, but as my kids get older, it's going to be more and more important for me to try to cultivate relationships and friendships with parents who have a similar racial consciousness. And it's something I don't really worry about with Black parents because they see the world through the same lenses that I do. But like for instance, the parents of the child during Halloween who were like holding, they let their child out of the house with a toy gun. There's no way, if our kids were the same age and they're not, there's no way I would be okay with letting my children go play with those kids like unsupervised on their own, or to go and to be supervised by those parents, right? Because those, to me, that demonstrates that those people are not thinking about things through the lens of Blackness. And you need to be able to do that if you're going to be in a relationship with Black people, especially in a space where their safety might be at risk and you might have to intervene, right? And so, like I don't go hunting on just anybody's land. And particularly in your case, Mehmet, where you've got people who are living in close proximity to you, it's going to be even more important that I trust your judgment of the people that you are in community with, and sort of like what sorts of boundaries and what sorts of things I need to look out for, because I can't be in that community and spend the time to like get to know those people the same way that you do to make sure that it's safe, right? So like if you had said something like, oh, I'd never thought about that, but I'm sure it'll be fine, then I would like we wouldn't be sitting here today talking, right? Because that to me would indicate that you're not paying attention to the ways that my Blackness is going to be understood in that space, right? So, and it's not that I necessarily expect people to have the same sort of consciousness that I do, because how could they? But, you can tell people who are, at least I can tell people who I can trust by how they react to what they don't know when it's pointed out that they don't know it when it comes to race, right? And so, when you're made aware of these things, you're like, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about that, but I immediately recognize that this is important and I see the implications of what this could mean. And I'm going to work towards making sure that this environment is safe and everything for this person that I care about, or the relationship that's sort of developing that I care about. then that makes me feel a lot more comfortable. But when people sort of like realize something that they don't know, but then sort of don't sort of resist picking up another lens to look through reality because it makes them uncomfortable, then it's very clear that I can't trust those folks. So, you know, the fact that I've been hunting on you and Amy's land and Mike and at Lost Creek Farm and everything like that, I think is a testament to like how comfortable I feel about you all's ability to see my Blackness, right? And to see how it might show up, because we've had conversations about that. And that's something that's very important. After the articles that I wrote, you know, about hunting and Blackness, you know, I got a lot of invitations from people. I got one the other day. People were like, "Oh, I read your article, it was so great. You know, if you ever want to come out hunting with me, that'd be awesome. I'd love to host you." When I bought my firearm at Dick's Sporting Goods, and they no longer sell firearms there, the guy who sold me a firearm was really awesome, really friendly dude. And like, he invited me out on a hog hunt in Arkansas, right? You know, he's like, "Yeah, if you ever want to go hunt pigs, you know, me and my buddies go down, da 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 da." And he's a white dude. And like in my, you know, and on the surface and presenting him, I'm like, "Oh yeah, wow, that sounds awesome, man. Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that." In my head, I'm like, "What, are you crazy? Me show up with you? You bring a black dude to a space, and I don't know you, and your boys don't know me, and I don't know where we're going, and I don't know who lives there. Like, are you out of your mind?" There's no way. So, you know, I think that's a really important thing. So in getting back to like, you know, getting ready to hunt on your land, the fact that your neighbor, when like we had a bunch of conversations, you and Amy had done a number of conversations with him, right? You had sort of come to him and told him, you know, had a conversation about, you know, these friends and everything. So you did the work to sort of make space. And then when I came in to like sight in my rifle, like he was there to help. And that was another opportunity for me to get a sense of him, and to get comfortable with him. And I did, right? And so, you know, the other thing is that I think is funny is that, like, you know, him or some members of his family like had like Trump stickers on their property, right? And normally, like, I see a Trump sticker, I'm going the other way, right? And it's not just, you know, Donald Trump, but it's sort of like anyone who sort of expresses what I think are sort of involuntarily embodies like this sort of like whiteness, white supremacy sort of mindset, right? But it was the work that you and Amy did to have these conversations, the conversations that we had about those things, and then me having space to meet this person that allowed me to sort of like understand him in his multiple identities and not just, you know, his or family members' political alignments, right? And it makes me think about the larger issue and the larger legacy of housing segregation and spatial segregation of people, and how that is still doing so much work to uphold whiteness and misunderstanding. And I really, really hate the like, we need to understand each other. No, Black people understand white people, right? We understand what we need to understand for the most part with white people, right? Because we have to, because if we don't, we put ourselves in danger. So it's not so much that Black people need to understand white people, or understand whiteness, I should say. It's that white people and people who aren't Black or aren't Indigenous need to understand those identities and where they fit in and have to account for their whiteness in those spaces, right? Because I account for my Blackness in every space that I'm in 24/7, all the time, right? And so, sorry, where was I going with that? I think that, yeah, housing segregation. And so, you know, the fact that most of us live and grow up and work in racially homogenous spaces, it allows like the socialization that we inherit for us to think about those other people in ways that society has constructed them. And that's very problematic and dangerous on both sides, but particularly when it's non-Black people contemplating Blackness, right? Because there's so much anti-Blackness that we're socialized to take up. But the fact that like you and Amy live in that community, and the work that you all are doing to build community with people has opened up space for me. The same with Mike and Amy in Lost Creek, like the way that you all show up in the world, and the things you talk about, the dinners that you host, and the conversations that you have, it creates space for people like me to feel comfortable to enter into these places. And so I think that that's an important thing that we have to be aware of. But I will say, like, I'm still nervous, when I come and like walk around on your property, right? Because there's another neighbor who I don't know and I haven't met, who had, like, last time I checked, like after the election, still had like a Blue Lives Matter Trump flag hanging from their yard, right? And so like we walk past them into the woods. So, it's still something that I think about. It's still something that I'm nervous about. But I've been to y'all's place a number of times, and like they see me, right? So I'm more worried about the unexpected Blackness and how people react to that than other things. But this sort of thing takes a lot of work. So in speaking to like the hunting industry and the frustrating ways that like many people who are at the head of that industry just sort of talk about, like, just get out there. Get out there and experience the wilderness, and, don't be afraid. And like, there's lots of people who are there to be welcoming to you and everything like that. I know that they're not talking to Black people. They're not, because nobody who understands the weight and the consequences of Blackness showing up in spaces that they're not being expected, or predominantly white spaces, would ever say to a Black person, just get out there, like, just go to the Capitol on January 6th as a Black person wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. Like, it'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen, right? Or, like, just go ahead and go to the grocery store with your open carry 38 Magnum as a Black person. What's the worst that could happen? Like, it's your right, or if you don't feel like answering the police officers' questions when they pull you over, then don't. It's your right to not do that. Those are words that are said by people who are not really thinking, or only thinking with that one lens and not thinking with these multiple lenses. So yeah, it's a lot. And I think one of the reasons why this is so hard to make progress in this is because I think a lot of people recognize that if they were to pick up these multiple lenses and look through the world in a less convenient lens, because whiteness is like a really nice convenient lens that you can pick up. Doesn't mean your life's not going to be difficult. You're not going to have challenges. But like, nobody who holds and picks up the lens of whiteness says, ooh, I'd like to pick up the lens of Blackness, because that looks like fun, right? You recognize the tax and you recognize the difficulty that it's going to be to do that. But that's our responsibility, right? If we're going to claim this space of being like allies, which is a term I don't really like because I prefer accomplices, not allies. Allies, what is it? Non-racist is to anti-racist what allies is to accomplice, right? You can be an ally and cheer from the sidelines and not risk yourself, and that's fine. But being an accomplice, somebody who's willing to risk something for the community that you want to see, you have to risk something to make it work. And part of that is embracing these difficult realities and conversations, and then living through this and putting into practice being anti-racist and being conscious of these things, which is hard. It's hard, but it's necessary. You can't have it both ways. You can't say like, oh yeah, I'm for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then like you don't build meaningful relationships with people of color, Black people. Or like, I'm for these sorts of things, but if you look at my bookshelf, if you look at my movies, if you look at my music, if you look at who I pay attention to and who I listen to, and it's like, only white people. Who's that person who writes like political analysis? Heather something, HRC.
Heather Richardson Cox, I think, right?
Heather Richardson Cox. Like I find her writing like unbearable because she never talks about race, right? There's never sort of any sort of racial analysis, right? And so, I think that like that's what white people are facing, right? If you're going to claim this space of being, an ally or being somebody who's for these sorts of things, then are you actually putting that into practice? Are you actually talking about these things, reading about these things in conversation? with these things. And it's a hard thing to do. It takes work and it's painful. But there's also a tremendous joy and solidarity, real solidarity involved in it. So, yeah.
Well, as much as I wanna keep talking, we are way over our time.
Yeah.
But I think let's not do the breakout rooms. Do we have any questions yet that you received, or?
None that I've received, but I have a couple here that I thought of as we were kind of having our discussion here. So something I think is really great about Mehmet, Jonathan, Amy, and Mike's work is you all use a variety of mediums. You know, involved in podcasts. We got these public talks such as Seedy Talks, different writing pieces that Jonathan has done. All of you are very good at social media. Why do you choose to engage in these particular mediums versus, I know at least in, you know, with Jonathan and Mehmet's case, you know, both being academics, and sort of, you know, there's an academic forum and there's these, you know, where knowledge production is supposed to be done or is thought of being done. So what do these other mediums offer us, and why do you all choose to engage in those?
What I want to say that like I engage in like scholarship as it exists, right? Academic scholarship and, you know, writing papers and stuff like that is a very settler colonial white supremacist space, right? I mean, you know, I've built more community out of the popular articles that I've written, out of the appearance on podcasts, and my like social media platforms than I have or will ever have from anything that I've ever written academically. And that's just by nature, that's just by virtue of the nature of the system, the academic institution that's being built. And so the analogy that comes to mind, and many of you may not get this, is like when Marshawn Lynch, who's a former football player, was being interviewed, and he was notorious for giving like really short interviews and not really wanting to be engaged. And eventually, you know, he was told that he had to show up to these interviews, like post-game interviews, so he wouldn't get fined. And so he sat down at the podium and said, "I'm just here so I don't get fined." And it's not quite that. I don't have that quite relationship with like formal scholarship or academic scholarship, because like there's a lot of it that I really enjoy doing. Like it was really fun to do Condor research, was, you know, one of the things that I do. It's really awesome and fun to interact with students to do the hunting research. But like I'm excited about getting publications because I know that that's going to keep me in the position, keep me in my job. Right? Like the actual, like having an article come out, like that's awesome. And it was a lot of hard work and everything like that. But, you know, I derive so much more satisfaction. And I think that I do so much more good in these platforms, in these discussions. And that the scholarship is like a means to an end. It serves a purpose. It's not, you know, vacuous, but, you know, like if I could get paid enough money or the same amount of money that I'm getting paid now to sort of put a roof over my head, help put food on the table, and, you know, have the freedom of time to interact with like all you wonderful people, then like I wouldn't have to publish another research paper again in my life. You know, we would do research and we would find findings, but like the process of like getting it published so that, you know, a bunch of mostly white, mostly male people can say good job, and then I can, you know, stay in my job. That's not very satisfying. But it does provide me an opportunity and a platform to interact with young people, which is something that I really enjoy and love. It does provide me an intellectual community, right? Because that's what this is. You don't have to be an academic to be part of an intellectual community, or I should say like a thought community. And so there's perks with it. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna, you know, kind of quickly just say that I mean, I think that we like have spent a lot of time kind of focused on the podcast and like building up a podcast, because I just sort of think in terms of storytelling and the like, I don't know, it's such a there are no visuals to audio, but at the same time, it is such a visual medium because you have the ability as an audio producer to sort of evoke so much. And I think that is just sort of one of the things that we like to do through any of our storytelling is sort of, build experiences that are kind of, sensory in a way, and like take people to certain times or situations and really try to put them in a place to understand what these stories are and to put them in the kind of environment that is conducive to understanding what other people have to say. And I think that just feels it feels effective to us because I think that there's like, we do storytelling through all of our food, and I think sometimes there's this idea that I am really frustrated by, which a lot of people are like, oh, food is the thing that brings everyone together. Right. Like, and I think they have this idea in their mind that like, Jonathan could sit down with like the local clan wizard and they would like sit down over a meal and they would talk about how like their aunts both made these amazing chicken and dumplings or something. And then they would be like best friends by the end of it, but I think that there's like, so that is like totally off base. But at the same time, I think that like for people who are already of the mindset and have already sort of opened themselves up to this level of curiosity and are open to these experiences, then like food is an amazing medium because it can help you like discover all these new worlds every day, but you have to sort of like establish that commitment first. And I think that that's just been like a really cool thing about something like the podcast is we've had so many people who've sort of like reached out and say like, man, the way that you guys told that story like put me in this place and made me think of it in a way that I've never thought of it before. Like whether it was this episode or like we got a lot of that kind of feedback around the seed episode, or in the Lunar New Year episode too, because it was like, why the hell are these guys kicking off this Appalachian food podcast about, Vietnamese and Chinese food tradition. So that's just been really, it's been really fun. And like, I think, we have also had these people like, we are not in academia. And like one thing that has been so frustrating has been like sometimes people who are in academia try to get Amy and I they're like, oh yeah, you should start publishing all this stuff in academic journals. Like, look, I don't know. Like, why the heck would we do that? I mean, we want this stuff to be sort of accessible, to other people if we're gonna put the work out there. So that's just what's kind of cool about the podcast format. It's like, it's free, it's open to everybody, and just one of the reasons that we like to do it.
Yeah, and I also have similar reasons. It's I think I'm also being a part-time faculty, also primarily being a farmer has a huge impact on that because my relation with people is also partly identified by my connection to other living beings as a farmer, which affects and speaks to how I interact with people. The other day there was an article in Dominion Post. A young journalist interviewed me, and then she was introducing me in the article and saying that professor in College at WVU, Dr. So and so, and then she switched immediately, talking about me with my first name, which I love because it makes me approachable, and people feel more comfortable about connecting with me because we shouldn't expect fostering relations or making connections, and being strategic about relations, to expect that magically is going to make us connect to each other and connect to our communities. It won't. I mean, it will never work. It's actually about and the fact that we are living right in rural side of West Virginia. There's a lot actually that we learn from our community. Me as a quote unquote foreigner, and learning a lot from them, and then hopefully they also have same kind of attitude, which I see. That there's a lot of exchange, cultural exchange. Amy, Mike, and Johnson know this. I mean, we built a, you know, oven on the property, and how much connection it brought between the community and the oven and the food and different cultures is just fascinating. So I think using these on social media and through different tools rather than in through an academic journal, which only a limited number of people is going to read. I would choose the first one, I think, because I don't want to just get stay inside this bubble of higher education, which can easily suck you in. I'd rather to be out there and just working with my hands and boots on the ground, literally. So and making real connections. So
Great. And Mehmet, if we have time for one more question.
one more question. Yes, I think. Do we have time for one more question? Or yes. Okay.
Great. Yeah, so thank you again, all three of you. I think it's very fascinating to see, and I think something that it came up for me through listening to all you talk was these themes around ownership or claiming ownership to an identity or to a place, but also being in relation. So how do you see those, I guess, the differences between ownership or claiming ownership versus being in relation, and what sort of different responsibilities do those entail?
I think one of the things that comes to mind with ownership is like a necessary condition of ownership is possession, but accountability is not one of those things, right? So if I own something, that I can like do with it what I want, and it's not built into the relationship of ownership that I am accountable for what I do with the thing or the person or whatever that I own. Hopefully that comes into play, but it's not a condition of ownership, right? Like I can like buy anything and own it and then immediately destroy it, and not necessarily be accountable to that. I could buy a new iPhone, right, and just smash it, and I may be accountable to myself. There's consequences for it, but like, that's within the realm of possibility. And, anybody looking on would be like, well, that wasn't a great decision. I mean, I would have made that decision, but that person's within their right to do that. Right. And so like, we see what happens, particularly when it comes to owning other people or trying to own other people or other sort of sovereign spaces. When the concept of ownership comes into play, then people do awful things to them, because the accountability aspect is what the owner says it is, right? I mean, we see this in the institution of slavery. Until emancipation or until more stringent legislation of accountability was put into place, you could do whatever you wanted with your Black person, and it was all fair game, right? You could, and many people were destroyed, right, by that relationship. But really, the only consequences were to the person who enslaved those folks, and like, oh well, now you need to go get another one, right? But there's no real system of accountability built into that. And so when you talk about relationship, right, that immediately evokes accountability, right? You say like, I'm in a relationship with somebody. You understand immediately that there's accountability to that you are accountable to tell the truth, you're accountable to treat that person well, and that you have to do right by that person. You don't necessarily have to do right by what you own, but you do have to do right by what and who you're in relationship with. So I think that's really like the key difference. And we see that this society, the United States of America society, and many settler colonial societies are built around ownership, not relationship, right? Like, why is Jeff Bezos so powerful? because he owns a lot of money and he owns a lot of resources and he owns a lot of stuff, and he does with them what he wants, right? You know, that's quite frankly just a bankrupt system. I think there's so much evidence to suggest that, and that, you know, if we want to live in a way that's more sustainable and that's more just, we have to talk about our existence in this world in terms of relation, which is, you know, something that indigenous people have been, you know, trying to teach people, you know, for millennia, and have lived by for millennia. Right? Not just indigenous people of these lands, but indigenous people everywhere. They understood that they had a responsibility to the other beings that they lived in community with, that they could not just do with them what they wanted, because there were consequences, and that the sort of the moral compass is being in good relation, right? And so, like, what does that mean? Well, it means being accountable, and sustainability and equality and being conscious of reciprocity is built into that. When you frame things just by changing the word, like, I don't own this land, I'm in relationship with this land. It's a really powerful thing that I think that we need to bring more to the forefront. But it does disrupt a lot. It does disrupt a tremendous amount of our lifeways, right? You know, like, you were just thinking about, we had to ask a question about scholarship, right? I own my papers, right? I'm the first author. That's my shit. But then that, you know, in order to maintain that, like, then I have to put that knowledge behind a paywall, right? And then that knowledge becomes the currency with which I can justify the resources that I claim to be able to like provide for myself and my family. I need to own stuff in order to understand my place in this world. So, you know, changing that framework is tremendously disruptive, but I think it's necessary. And I don't know what it's going to look like sort of in the aftermath, but I know that I don't want to be in a relationship with people who don't recognize that. I'll just end on that.
Yeah, I think one thing that is very interesting to observe is to sort of to see the people who tend to be the most consumed by this idea of ownership, and think about what their relations are like. You know, I mean, we know people in our families who like, their idea of success is owning the most things, but all their relations are bad. You know, like, they're terrible at maintaining relationships. We know people who run programs and do work that is, you know, purportedly based in community work and in you know, in relations on many levels. But the people who run these programs talk about things in language that is like, oh, these people work for me, right? Like, it's probably not a surprise that those people, like, all of their relations have totally fallen apart, right? Like, that's because ownership is directly counter to being in a relationship. And yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting to think about that. But I mean, one of the things I'll say is it is just like so infectious. And once you start sort of thinking about hunting or foraging in terms of relations, you think about everything else in terms of relations. And that's why I was using that example earlier with the guy with like ramp harvesting, because it's not about the tangible act of like how you harvest ramps that is the important thing to pass on. It's like the mentality and the language of like what it means to be in relation with things. And that is when we talk about, you know, systemic problems and like region-wide issues with overharvesting or something. I'm more concerned with like how we're relaying you know, the language and how we're sort of like impressing upon all these other people that follow us on social media or whatever, like the importance of being in relation. Because the other side of it, as we've talked about with extractive industry and everything else, is like, well, we own these things and they're there for us to dominate and to do whatever the heck we want with them, you know. And if we expect to be sustained on any level by those things in the future, then we, you know, we can't have that mentality or it won't work. It'll fall apart. So.
I just want to add one quick thing about like with hunting too, because, you know, I struggled with trying to like trying to deal with the concept of like taking a life, right? And the other ways, the other ways before I came to this kind of understanding were not quite satisfying, right? Indigenous scholar, I'm sure that many Indigenous scholars would talk about this, but the person I learned this from was Kim Tallbear, who's an amazing Indigenous scholar and just like thinker. You know, she critiqued like the settler colonial hierarchies of life, right? And so now, you know, sort of this is going to be a little bit of a critique of how like diet preferences are sort of understood within the settler colonial society, right? And so, you know, I think a lot of people understand, a lot of people come to what animals are comfortable eating based on this like hierarchy of life. Like they'll eat fish, but not red meat because like cows are cute or something like that. It's easier for them to relate to a cow than it is to a fish. Or, you know, like, for example, like consuming dogs, consuming canids is something that's anathema in this society. And that's basically because of our relationship with dogs. But you know, in thinking about the animals that I would consume, I don't eat dogs, by the way. But in thinking about the animals that I consume, it wasn't quite satisfying for me to say like, oh, well, I'm okay with eating a deer because like, and I was thinking of this like, you know, I think I perceive deer to be less intelligent than like pigs, right? So there was a period where I didn't eat pork, and I was like, oh yeah, because pigs are like so smart. But that really wasn't satisfying to me until I heard Kim Tallbear critique what I understood that way of thinking. And it wasn't until I understood her critique of like hierarchies of life and then centered the relationship that exists, right? That every being has personhood, right? Every being has personhood. The plants that you are in community with, they have personhood as we sort of understand it. They are their own organisms and entities unto themselves. So what that does for me is that centers the responsibility in the relationship of, if I'm going to take a life of a relative, then I have a responsibility to that, and I don't do it lightly. And that to me is a much more satisfying way of thinking about how I'm in relationship with the organisms and the beings that I consume. Because there's really no way around the violence and like the discomfort that I think most people feel by taking a life, right? And sometimes we might feel that, you know, more, we feel that violence and maybe the moral difficulty of the concept of a life being lost based on that being's proximity to how we understand ourselves. But how our perception of how that being's proximity to ourselves is not the thing that necessarily, I think, guides how we are in relationship with certain beings, because that could lead people to own certain beings that they don't feel a close sort of relationship with. But when we say like every being has personhood, every being has this, and so like then it forces us to think about, okay, what does it mean to take this being's life? And we don't do it, and if we do that, we don't do it lightly. We don't do it cavalierly. We don't like think like, oh, it's okay to go out and just shoot a big buck and only harvest the animal's, you know, horns to put on our wall. That's not being in good relation. So if I'm going to take a life, then I need to use that life well, right? I need to justify the violence of taking a life in everything that I do with that being's life afterwards. So I need to take care of it. I need to take that life quickly and as painlessly and with little violence as possible, which is why, you know, I was so happy when I shot that deer, and Mike and I, we were sort of breaking down the carcass, and I realized that I like took the time to like, okay, I need to know how this relative died. Did she die quickly or did she suffer? Right. And so, you know, when we opened her up, I saw that I had shot her through, there was a lot of blood on the ground. So I knew that she bled out really quickly. So I was like, okay, that's good, because she didn't sort of like flail and sort of suffer for a long period of time. And then eventually when we gutted her, I saw that the bullet had passed through her, or the bottom part of her spine, right? So she was like, she went down immediately. And so for, I had reasonable expectation that she didn't feel a tremendous amount of pain, sort of at least in the back half of her body, because her spinal cord had been severed. And so, that all goes into that with with this idea that I don't take a life lightly. And then in using that animal, like Heidi, a student who graduated from WVU, she had a story that really struck me once. It was during my lab open house, where she was talking about like bringing deer that she and her father hunted back home to WVU and putting it in a freezer, and then the power going out. And like she lost a bunch of food. She had food that she had bought from the grocery store, but she was so upset by the food that spoiled, by the deer meat that had spoiled in that freezer, because of the relationship that she had with that animal and that experience. And so, I think it's so important for us to think about that, to center the relationship and the responsibility that we have, because then it really keeps us in a better place where we don't enjoy killing, right? Just for the sake of killing, and that we take a responsibility and we don't do this sort of thing lightly, because that's where we want to be, right? We don't necessarily want to say like, oh, I'm not going to eat this organism because only because I can relate to it, personally. But if I'm not going to take that life because I can't use that life responsibly. That's where we want to be. I think, rather than like, oh no, this animal is like more like me, so I wouldn't harm it. But I think it's important to center that responsibility. Taking a life, it's violent. We can't avoid that.
Yeah, I think this is also, what I always think about when saving seeds as a seed saver. It's that ownership. The idea of ownership is can easily get dangerous. In indigenous cultures here, and in also my own culture in Asia Minor, in Anatolia also, seeds are communal. They belong to communities, and that's why in Turkey they usually old seeds don't have names, because people didn't feel the urge to give them a name. It's just they are part of their families that they keep stewarding. And just like Kim Tolbear, I would recommend people to perhaps follow. She's very active on social media, specifically on Instagram. Rowan White would be an amazing, inspiring person to follow, to understand that reciprocity, among the living beings, and basically that responsibility towards the seed, and not having its ownership, speaks directly to how you work with people and how you connect and communicate with people. You basically, if you understand that relation, you basically won't tell people how to do their work. When you try to collaborate with them, you will try to understand them, and then you will actually listen, and then you will collaborate. If there's a need for collaboration, rather than telling people how to do their, how to live, or how to do their work. So I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of overlaps between all these topics, but it's 4 p.m. and I still see there's 26 people, other than us, 22, 23 people stayed up until this time. But I would, I don't want to take more of anyone's time. And I'll just ask, do you have any closing statements? Jonathan, Mike, and Amy, if you want to, final thoughts. Anything?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, I was just gonna say I don't know, and I've we've covered a lot in this.
Yeah.
But I think that like a few of those points, just to sort of emphasize, I'm glad that we wrapped up on this point of relations, because I think that's maybe, in terms of overarching themes, I mean, one of the things that I would certainly present as a key takeaway from all of this. So that was that was good. But no, this has been a great discussion, and I mean, as always, talking with you guys about this stuff is
Likewise.
it's great. And like I was saying earlier, it's all a continuum of learning. I mean, I've
Yeah.
learned so much just today, so it's been awesome.
Mhm.
There's like so much that I guess that I want to say. I think that as always, this is just such a wonderful thing to be in conversation with you all. It's one of the things that I enjoy most about living in West Virginia, and having the opportunity to meet with you all, and like this platform to reach other people has just been tremendous. I guess I would say as it relates to the topic of race and Blackness, I think that one of the things that I would want people to take from this conversation is to try to be more honest with yourselves about where and how you show up around this topic, right? And for the white people in the audience, I think one of the things that I think is really important is to account for your whiteness in the spaces that you exist. And that's not something that you have to do. That's not something that you're socialized to do. That's not something that's easy to do. But it's so important to be able to do that, to be able to account for your whiteness, to understand how your whiteness shows up in every space that you're in, and to not take it for granted that you don't have to think about that. If you're going to claim solidarity and allyship with non-white folks, it's so important to do. So yeah, and maybe I should put my PayPal account on here in case anybody wants to tip their server. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, and the other thing I would say is just lean into the curiosity that is like this conversation, and that is this discussion. And to understand, and I guess the last thing I'll say is, and that to understand that being a good person, right, whatever that means, is not a state. It's a practice, right? You can't do a certain set of deeds and then be like you don't get a lifetime membership in the good person club, right? This is one of the things that we see oftentimes when like folks are contemplating race, particularly white people contemplating race, like, oh, but I'm a good person. Like that's not a thing. Like being a good person is a daily practice. And being anti-racist is a daily practice. And disrupting settler colonialism is a daily practice that we all wake up each day and have to do if we're committed to this, to the world that we want to see, and to recognize that it's not always going to go well, right? You're not always going to have a good day. Like some days it's not going to be so great, but it's important to keep doing it, and to understand that it is a daily practice and we have to keep at it. So. Yeah, and let's all eat some good food if and when we can, right? If we have access to it,
Yeah.
And invite someone to eat some good food with you, because good food tastes way better when you got like awesome humans to share it with. So, yeah, and just thank you, Matt, for this incredible series, because this has been such an amazing thing. For WVU, I think, particularly. And when Seedy Talks was housed in G&G, it was an incredible thing. Yeah, I just want to recognize you for all of the amazing work that you're doing. And I know that it is not properly recognized, or hasn't been properly recognized, but this is a tremendous space, and a lot of credit needs to go to you for that.
Thank you. But it's recognized by good folks, so that's perhaps enough. I don't know.
Oh,
good folks such as yourselves. What?
Yeah. And please subscribe to Lost Creek Patreon page.
Yes.
If you love what Mike and Amy are doing at Lost Creek Farm, and if you don't, then that kind of makes you racist.
There are Patreon pages for that too, I think.
Right. So, please support them because they're doing tremendous work under tremendously difficult circumstances, right, with the pandemic.
Yes.
We need more folks in the world to do the things that they do. So, yeah.
Yes, and watch the podcast. Yes, listen to the podcast.
Listen to the podcast.
The second episode is coming soon, so don't miss that. Thank you all so much. This was an amazing talk, and then it was an honor to be a host of you all three. And thanks for all the work you do, the amazing work you do. Thanks so much, and thanks Jed. Thanks Jed for staying so long with us. We appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who joined. All right. Have a good day. Bye.